They say DNA never lies. But Camille's DNA didn't just tell the truth. It betrayed everything she believed. Her father, the man who raised her, smiled in every childhood photo, signed every birthday card, wasn't hers. Not biologically. Not by blood. One quiet afternoon, a home DNA kit turned into a wrecking ball. A single email shattered her family story in 4 lines or less. The real father? Dead. Gone before she could ever ask him why. Before she even knew he existed. And with him went every answer. That moment wasn't just personal heartbreak, it was identity collapse. Because when Camille looked deeper into her results, the questions multiplied. Her ancestry didn't trace back to the names she knew, or the places she'd grown up hearing in stories. Instead, it stretched into landscapes her family never mentioned, places no one ever claimed. It wasn't just one secret. It was centuries of silence. She was Swiss. That part never changed. But suddenly, her Swissness felt different, because the DNA was telling a second version of history. A hidden version. A version that said, the story you've lived may not be the one you came from. And Camille isn't alone. Across the Alps, across dining rooms and dusty photo albums, DNA tests are uncovering stories that never made it into school books or family trees. Ancestries are shifting. Origins are being redefined. And under it all, something older is stirring. Because Camille's results didn't just expose a family's forgotten truth. They pulled on a thread buried deep in the Swiss genome. One that doesn't stop with one woman or one name. It stretches into the soil of an entire region. A place where the people speak Italian, worship like Romans, but, somehow, carry the blood of Spanish warriors. And that makes no sense at all. They speak Italian. They cross themselves in church. Their surnames are older than the valleys they live in. But when the DNA results came back, the answer wasn't Italy. It was Spain. Deep in Ticino, the southern pocket of Switzerland tucked into the Alps, villagers opened their ancestry maps expecting Roman roots. Latin blood, something local, something known. What they got instead was Iberian. Not once. Not in one village. But again and again and again. Blue lines on ancestry charts, pulling toward the western edge of Europe. Toward a place these families had never seen, never claimed. How could this be? Ticino is surrounded by everything Italian, language, culture, faith. But the blood told another story. A story not written in church records or family Bibles, but in centuries-old strands of DNA. Scientists took a closer look and uncovered something no one expected. The Visigoths. Nomads. Invaders. A Germanic people who once sacked Rome, then crossed the Alps in silence. What history left out? DNA preserved. As the Roman Empire collapsed, the Visigoths swept west. Some stayed in Spain. Others, fewer, forgotten, drifted through northern Italy and into Ticino. They didn't build empires there. They built families. They married into Celtic and Latin bloodlines. Their fair skin, light eyes, swallowed into the dark features of the mountains. No statues. No ruins. Just bones and babies. And somehow, across 1,500 years, their legacy survived. Not in museums, but in saliva. Camille's strange ancestry wasn't a glitch. It was a whisper from this forgotten wave. And suddenly, a pattern began to form. What other migrations had slipped through the cracks? If Visigoth blood could live in Italian-speaking Swiss towns, what other strangers had rewritten the map without leaving a trace? Because Ticino wasn't the only region carrying a secret. And the next one didn't just leave names behind. It left a language, a people, and the biggest genetic transformation Switzerland had ever seen. It wasn't just the Visigoths. Go further, much further. Before cathedrals, before empires, before even the idea of Switzerland. Around 5,000 years ago, the earth beneath the Alps trembled, not from war, but from footsteps. Thousands of them, coming from the east. Across the Ponto-Caspian steppe, a vast sea of grass, a new people were moving. Restless, untamed. The Yamnaya. They didn't just migrate. They transformed everything they touched. They rode horses before anyone else. Drove wagons across land no one had crossed. And wherever they settled, they buried their dead with tools, beads, weapons, in ways no one had seen before. But the real revolution? It wasn't what they carried. It was who they were. They brought a new language, the roots of nearly every tongue spoken from Ireland to India. They brought new genes, and they didn't just mix in. They took over. By 2860 BCE, their DNA reached the soil of what is now Switzerland. The corded where culture was born, named after their pottery, but shaped by their blood. These weren't farmers anymore. These were hybrid descendants of the steppe, fast, mobile, complex. And we still carry their shadow. Modern Swiss genomes, even today, still bear the fingerprint of these ancient riders. Not just in DNA, but in identity. Because this wasn't just migration. It was transformation. A complete rewiring of the human map. But not everywhere. Because in the middle of this sweeping change, the strange silence appears. Villages where the Yamnaya never reached. Graves with no corded wear goods. Women whose DNA stayed untouched. As if they'd never heard the hoofbeats. Never saw the wagons pass. While one Switzerland stepped into a new world, another one stayed behind. And for almost 1,000 years, they lived side by side. Two civilizations. One land. And not a single clue why. We thought the story was simple. The steppe riders came, and the old world disappeared. But then came the anomaly. In a small Swiss valley, buried under Bronze Age soil, archaeologists found her. A woman. Buried with care, with tools, with tradition. But her DNA said something strange. She had none of it. None of the steppe ancestry. None of the Yamnaya code. Not even a trace. And she wasn't alone. Time and again, they showed up in the record. Women whose blood held no mark of the Great Migration. As if they had slipped through time. As if the steppe had never touched them. How? For over 1,000 years, after the corded where culture spread across Central Europe, these women lived, untouched, unmerged, beside a people who had already changed. Two societies. One new, one ancient. Living in the same landscapes. Drinking from the same rivers. But genetically separate. They married differently. Buried differently. Cooked and cared and farmed by different rhythms. One lineage forged by conquest and expansion. The other, held in place, like stone. This wasn't replacement. It wasn't a melting pot. It was a quiet standoff. A long, patient coexistence. Imagine two houses, side by side in a mountain pass. One raised by the sons of riders, blonde hair, blue eyes, steppe fire in their bones. The other, daughters of the soil, descendants of farmers, rooted for millennia. They saw each other. They traded, maybe even prayed together. But they didn't mix. Not for centuries. And that raises a haunting question. If the Yamnaya swept across Europe like a tide, how did these women stay dry? What shielded them? What held them back? And what did they know that no one else did? Because for these women, resistance wasn't war. It was survival. But their story doesn't end there. Because when they finally did step out from their valleys, they carried something ancient with them. Something no one expected. And it would take another genetic twist to understand how. They didn't fight. They didn't conquer. They married. While the world changed around them, the women walked into it. From high mountain valleys, cut off by ice and time, they came down. One by one. Generation by generation. They brought no armies, no wagons, no steppe fire. But in their bones, they carried something far older. The blood of the first farmers. The last of the Neolithic. And they didn't surrender it. They passed it on. Because while the men stayed rooted in villages, in customs, in control, the women moved. They left their childhood homes to marry into new ones, into the steppe settlements, into the corded where culture. And they brought their ancestry with them. A mother's mitochondrial line, passed on through daughters, unbroken for thousands of years. The Yamnaya may have reshaped the map, but the map still had memory, and that memory lived in women. You won't see their names carved in stone. You won't find their faces in museums, but their genes, still here, in the teeth of Bronze Age children, in the wombs of future nations. Patrolocality, that's the word researchers use. Men stayed. Women traveled. But what that really means is this. The newcomers may have ruled the land, but the women carried its soul. They whispered old songs into new ears. fed old grains to new mouths, tucked forgotten stories into the folds of daily life. Not erased, just folded in. And if you listen close, you can still hear them. Because these women weren't just wives. They were carriers of memory, of resilience, of worlds that refused to disappear. But even they couldn't reach everywhere. Because deep in the Alps, far from marriage routes and trade paths, some places held tighter to the past. Places where time didn't just slow down. It stopped. And what lived there wasn't just survival. It was isolation, with a secret of its own. Some women moved between worlds, but some never left theirs. High above the lowlands, where valleys turn into silence and roads vanish into stone, a forgotten migration took root. The Walser. They weren't conquerors. They weren't fleeing war. They were settlers from Valais, venturing into the untouched folds of the Alps. And once they got there, they stayed. Generation after generation, century after century, locked in by snow, by cliffs, by time itself. These weren't just villages. They were living capsules, tucked away from cities, from politics, from progress. The outside world shifted, kingdoms fell, languages evolved, bloodlines blended. But in the Walser valleys, almost nothing changed. They kept their own dialects, strange, beautiful hybrids spoken nowhere else. They married within their own, again and again, until the gene pool became something singular. And now, their DNA tells a story few others can, because buried inside their blood is a signature most Europeans have never carried. Haplogroup W6. Rare. Isolated. Unexpected. It shouldn't be here. Not in the numbers found. But it is. And that's the power of isolation. While the rest of Switzerland blurred into the modern age, the Walser remained sharp, distinct, frozen in time. Every footpath between their villages was once a lifeline. Every name in their church books echoes back to the same few ancestors. They didn't adapt to history. They held it at the door. And in doing so, they preserved something even they didn't realize they were holding. Not just a way of life, a genetic fossil, but in every ancient pattern, something strange eventually appears. A crack in the code, a result that doesn't fit, because not every mystery lives in survival. Some are born from confusion, and one of them, the next one, starts with a man from Ticino, and a mutation no one saw coming. After centuries of stillness came the noise. Not far from the quiet Walser valleys, a different kind of silence was uncovered. A pile of bones, twisted, tangled, 20 bodies, collapsed together under ancient timber. No weapons, no jewelry, no signs of battle, just a sudden end frozen in soil. For years, archaeologists thought they'd found something ritual, a Celtic sacrifice, an offering to forgotten gods. But science had other plans, because when they pulled DNA from those bones, everything changed. These men weren't family. No shared blood. No clan. Most were strangers to each other. Young. Male. From far beyond this region. The isotopes in their teeth told the rest. They were travelers. Outsiders. Some barely local at all. And the way their bones lay. Not ceremony. Catastrophe. A bridge, most likely, wooden, unstable, collapsed beneath them. Not a sacrifice. A disaster. But a disaster that left no survivors to speak. Only DNA. Only questions. Who were they? Why were they traveling together? What were they doing that far from home? And why did the story have to be buried for 2,000 years before it could be told? It's easy to forget. Ancient DNA doesn't just uncover kings and tribes and migrations. Sometimes it solves cold cases. One tooth, one jaw, one forgotten grave can shift the meaning of a site, from myth to tragedy. And yet, even in tragedy, the genome speaks. Even in ruins, there are echoes. And just when you think the evidence is solid, the science familiar, something appears that doesn't belong. Not a mystery solved, but one born. Because DNA doesn't just rewrite the past. Sometimes it breaks the rules. And in one man, in one sample from southern Switzerland, that's exactly what it did. A genetic anomaly. A mutation so rare, it shouldn't exist in Europe. But it does. And it lives inside a man from Ticino. He was just one man. a participant in a routine Y-DNA survey, part of a study mapping genetic patterns across Switzerland. Nothing unusual, no big headlines, until the results came back. One marker, one specific genetic signature, didn't match anything known in Europe. Not in Switzerland, not in Italy, not in the whole of the Western continent. It matched East Asia, a deletion near the amylogenin gene, seen before, but only in certain Asian populations. And now, it was in a Swiss man from Ticino. Same valley, same language, same alpine blood. But this gene, it didn't belong. It sat inside the R1b lineage, the most common Y chromosome family in Western Europe. And yet, this mutation had never, ever, been recorded in that context. It shouldn't exist. But it does. So where did it come from? Ancient trade routes? A forgotten traveler who never went home? A caravan that crossed too far? Or was it something stranger? A spontaneous mutation, born in isolation, hidden for generations until now? No one knows. But that one gene tells a story no history book has ever written. A whisper that skips across centuries and geography. Like a fingerprint from a ghost. It raises the question scientists fear most, not because they don't have answers, but because they know how fragile those answers are. Because when your DNA starts behaving like it crossed continents, without moving, the map no longer makes sense. The rules no longer hold. And if that's possible, if something so foreign can be buried inside something so local, what else might we be missing? Because as rare as this mutation is, it wasn't the only line that shocked researchers. There's a deeper fracture still. Not in one man, but across an entire nation. A split, so silent, so ancient, it cut straight through the Alps. And no one saw it until the chromosomes did. That one mutation from Ticino, rare, foreign, unexplained, it opened a door. But what came next cracked the entire foundation. A national DNA survey. Thousands of samples. North to south, valley to city, French to German to Italian. On the surface, unity. Shared language zones, political borders, one small country, tightly woven. But under the microscope, a fracture. The Alps didn't just shape the landscape. They split the blood. A deep genetic divide ran straight through the mountains. Not a little variation. A wall. Men from the north carried one genetic signature. Men from the south another. Haplogroups, markers, lineages, sharp, ancient, unmixed. Centuries of migration couldn't blur it. Modern roads couldn't bridge it. Even national identity couldn't erase it. Switzerland, unified on the map, fractured in the genome. Not by war, not by conflict, but by time. The Alps, majestic and quiet, had done something powerful. They hadn't just separated people. They'd preserved difference. In language, the edges smoothed. In culture, things blended. But in Y-DNA, in the deep patrilineal line, the old borders still stood, unmoved, unchanged. A reminder that geography isn't just backdrop, it's a force. And even today, your last name might carry a code that remembers which side of the ridge your ancestors couldn't cross. But here's the strangest part. That divide, the one written in the genes, it doesn't end cleanly. Because in some places, especially the oldest alpine valleys, the DNA gets harder to read. The signals blur. The origins vanish. The boundaries stop making sense. As if something ancient, something more isolated than we imagined, is still hiding. A place that held out longer than anyone thought. And the only clue is carried in the daughters. In the deepest parts of Switzerland, where the mountains fold into themselves, where even the wind forgets your name, something is missing. No stones, no stories, no graves we can read. But the DNA says they were there. Women, many of them, living for centuries after the steppe migrations. Unchanged, undisturbed. Their genomes held no trace of Yamnaya blood, while the rest of Europe shifted, mixed, evolved they did not. And yet, no one knows where they lived. We call them non-steppe females. But that isn't a name. It's an absence. An echo in the mitochondria, passed from mother to daughter, from fire pit to fire pit, until the line disappears. No texts, no temples, just a pattern in the genes. They left no weapons, no ornaments, no burial mounds shouting we were here. Just silence. And in that silence, a question. How did they avoid everything? The invasions, the new languages, the reshaping of Europe. What valleys were so remote, so hidden, that even time couldn't touch them? Some researchers call them alpine refugia, sanctuaries tucked above the migration waves. Tiny folds in the map where the ancient held on. Maybe they lived in isolation. Maybe they had no reason to change. Or maybe the world forgot them before they ever had the chance to speak. All we know is their daughters survived long enough to pass the signal down. Not loud, not clear, but enough. Enough to tell us that a part of Switzerland, the oldest part, still hasn't been found. Because these women were more than anomalies. They were the keepers of a memory older than language. A lineage that outlasted conquest. A whisper carved into the roots of the mountains themselves. And if we can find where they lived, if we can trace the map their DNA hints at, we may not just rewrite Swiss history. We may recover a piece of human history that was never written at all. Camille thought her story began with a man and ended with a test. But her truth wasn't just buried in her father's silence. It was hidden in the rhythm of the past. A rhythm the genome remembers, even when we do not. A mother's lineage, passed in whispers. A father's name, sometimes never spoken. And between them, the fracture. Camille's life unraveled when her DNA told a different story. But now we see, it wasn't just hers. Across Switzerland, that same pattern repeats. Hidden paternity, forgotten migrations, matrilines that survive in silence. This isn't a rare case. It's a blueprint, a prehistoric echo playing out in modern lives. Because DNA doesn't care about stories we tell ourselves. It doesn't ask permission. It doesn't need proof. It simply speaks. And when it does, it tells us who we are, not who we hope to be. Every mutation, every anomaly, every unexpected result is more than a clue. It's a challenge. To history, to memory, to identity itself. Camille's result didn't just break her family story. It unlocked an ancient mirror, one that shows us how much we've lost, and how much might still be waiting. Because somewhere in the Alps, in one grave, untouched by time, lies a gene that changed everything we thought we knew. Not just about Switzerland, but about us. About the moment human history turned, and what came before. If you believe DNA is more than a map, but a mystery, subscribe for what's coming next. Because the past isn't over. It's buried, and we're just beginning to dig.